Hey everyone! This week we are diving deeper again into looking at the legislative branch. So, leading up to this point, we've talked about some of the basic structures of Congress, including what is the breakdown of power organization, looking at the House of Representatives, looking at the Senate, what are some of those specific powers under each of the different chambers. And then we have investigated even further at to looking at term limits and maybe why term limits are a good thing, why are they not a good thing, and we're delving deeper into just the operations of what Congress does. So this week we're taking a look at the topic of how a bill becomes a law. So, getting straight into this, a bill is a piece of legislation that has not been signed yet. Okay, so a bill is what a law is called when it is still maturing. Okay, so basically what happens is someone is going to research and write this piece of legislation. This may be a Congress member, this may be an interest group, okay, but someone is going to write it, and only a Congress member can introduce it into Congress. So, once we are starting the introduction process, we are going to introduce a bill in what's called a committee. That committee is really that first official moment that a bill gets put into the system. It is discussed among discussed among people more than just the author. Okay, this is where we're starting to share it with other members of Congress. And a lot of the work is done in the committee. We're going to talk more about committees in just a couple of minutes, but just know this is actually where most bills are going to die. They are not going to progress further, and that's the point of committee, is that good bills are made even better and bad bills are siphoned out. Okay, much of that work, like I said, is done there in the committees. After a bill is passed by its committee, it's going to move to one of the chambers. We call this the originating chamber. So a bill may move from committee to the Senate, or it may move from committee to the House. It just depends on what the topic of the bill is. Remember, there's certain topics that have to start in one of the chambers, right? Outlined in the Constitution. Take, for instance, the House of Representatives. Any bill coming through that deals with finances or revenue for the federal government has to start in the House of Representatives. Okay, so that's just an example of that originating chamber process. So, say we have a bill that went through committee, was introduced into the House, it is passed by the House of Representatives, it then needs to move on to the Senate, to that second chamber. Okay, so any bill that may have started and went into the Senate would vice versa have to be approved by the House. Again, we're looking at that system of checks and balances. Okay, so we not only have checks and balances among the three branches of government, but we also have checks and balances among the two chambers of our legislative branch. If a bill is passed through the House and the Senate, and they have the exact same language coming out of both, the bill then moves on to the president for that final signature and approval. Now, this president may sign a bill and it officially becomes law, or a president has the power to veto a law, upon which instance that bill is going to go back to the originating chamber. Okay, so whatever chamber it went to after a committee, if a bill is vetoed by a president, it goes back to that originating chamber. Now again, checks and balances, right, among the branches. If the legislature still wants that piece of legislation to go into effect, and there is an overwhelming amount of support for a bill, 2/3, okay, that's a big fraction to remember, Congress can override a veto with a 2/3 vote. Okay, so make sure you remember that fraction, 2/3 and over to override a veto. Taking a look at more of those specific powers, okay, thinking about legislation, like I said, all tax or revenue bills have to start in the House. And when a bill is going through the House, it's going to have some very strict rules upon which people can talk about it with. In the House, you have a time limit for how long you can talk on an issue, and there may be limits as to how many amendments can be made to this bill before we run out. Okay, so this is where when we're talking about strict rules. There could be open rules or closed rules. Open is like you can make an unlimited amount of amendments, which are changes to a bill, or you may have closed rules where you're just debating the bill as a whole, you're not allowed to change anything, and typically it's going to be decided by the majority party. Okay, so whatever party has control in the House, they are going to control the rules around discussing bills. In the Senate, we have a super special power called a filibuster. Okay, a filibuster is only allowed in the Senate. Okay, you can't filibuster in the House, you can only filibuster in the Senate. And a filibuster is when you continuously keep talking about a bill. Now, why would we want a filibuster? Why is this even something that we talk about in terms of making law? Well, a filibuster can delay a vote, so that way there's more research that can be done very quickly to bring more information in and try to persuade people to vote a certain way. Okay, so we can delay a vote, or you're literally talking people into boredom, so that way they lose interest on the vote or whatever the topic of the bill is. And if they lose interest, maybe they won't vote how you hope they will vote. Okay, so it's very much a tool to either persuade or persuade to vote or persuade to not vote on a certain piece of legislation. Now, if the Senate, a overwhelming majority, 60 people out of our 100, so 60% of the Senate, if they're all tired of listening to this person continuously talk, they can vote on what's called a cloture. Okay, and a cloture is a vote to say, we're all done listening to you. And if a cloture passes with 60 votes, then that person is done. They have to step away from the microphone and can no longer talk at that moment. Okay, so overall in the House there are 23 committees, and in the Senate there are 17 committees. Now, when we are taking a look at the bigger chambers, whoever is in charge of running the chamber, okay, so typically your Speaker of the House, your President pro tempore, they are the ones that are creating what's called a docket. And a docket is essentially an agenda by which everyone has to follow. So the leaders of each chamber create the agenda of which order they're going to talk about which bills in. This is a huge power by leadership in the chambers, because if they don't like a piece of legislation, they can put it at the bottom of the docket or the bottom of the agenda. And people may forget about it, we may run out of time by the end of the year. Okay, so it's a huge power. Just to make sure you guys know, in order to vote on a bill, you need to have a quorum, or at least more than 50%. Okay? So you can't vote on a bill if you're missing most of your members of Congress. Okay? You have to make sure that you have enough people in attendance, that you can get a majority of representatives or senators overall, and that is called a quorum. So we're learning some pretty big terms here. Coming out of this slide, you want to make sure you know what a filibuster is, what a cloture is, a docket, and a quorum. So let's break down this idea of committees. Again, this is kind of where a bill starts our official process. Okay, what are committees in the first place? Well, they allow Congress to divide up work among smaller groups. So you're going to have a small group of senators or small groups of representatives who are coming together, and it is reducing again how many bills are going to full chamber. It's again a way to siphon out the bad bills and a way to make the good bills even better. One of the things about committees is that most of the time, if people are serving on a certain committee, they are the expert in that topic. So we are having our experts on the topic, or we are having the topic that is most relevant to your district, is what kind of committee you are going to be serving in if you are a representative or a senator. So some examples that we're going to break down here of different types of committees in our system. We have a conference committee, we have joint committees, we have select committees, standing committees, and subcommittees. You are going to want to know these 5 different types of committees. Okay, this will be something that you will be assessed over, so know that going forward. A standing committee is the most common type of committee. These ones are permanent. They are always going to be there, whether there's a change in history or a change in who is serving in Congress at the time. And these are kind of like the big topics that our country are always going to have to deal with. So committees that deal with budget, committees that deal with homeland security issues or government affairs, agriculture, nutrition, forestry, always topics that our country are going to have a stake in debating about. Again, these are permanent committees. So you can see here in the image kind of what a committee may look like, where you've got small groups of people who are getting together to talk about very specific issues. And then if a bill is passed out of committee, all of those different circles there would come together to talk about it as a whole, as well as the other issues from other committees. Next, we have our select committees. This is one of the great powers of Congress, which is legislative oversight, where the legislative branch is able to investigate certain issues that are happening within our country and determine, is there an issue here? How does our government address these issues moving forward? So select committees are not permanent. Okay, they are set up temporary for a very particular study or investigation. So, for example, anything that deals with intelligence. Okay, if you're dealing with a certain country, dealing with cybersecurity, things like that, you may have a select committee that is brought together to deal with that issue. In 2016, following the presidential election, there was a lot of concern about Russian interference with our elections. And so Congress set up a select committee of people who would investigate this issue and determine, is there any truth to this? And how do we move forward from this moment? Is there any legislation that we need to make as a country in order to combat this specific issue? Same thing happened after 9/11. Okay, just another example. So national security concerns absolutely can be formed select committees over. So again, these are temporary. Once this issue is finished, they're probably going to disband the committee. These committee members will go join another committee for the long term. Okay, again, this is a great power of the legislative branch, that power of legislative investigation and oversight. Okay, so the power of Congress to review, monitor policy, and implementation of federal agencies. Again, trying to remedy something very specific that has happened. Next, we have what's called a joint committee. And a joint committee is going to be made up of members of both the House and the Senate, because probably both the House and Senate have a stake at the topic at hand. So for example, printing issues, taxation, and economics. Okay, both the House and Senate need to have a voice in those topics of bills coming through, so you're going to have both House and Senate members in it. Whereas a typical standing committee, you may not have both House and Senate members in there. Next, we have a conference committee. A conference committee is if we have a bill that has gone through the House, and then once it goes to the Senate, there's a lot of changes that can be made or have been made. Remember, any bill that ends up going to the president has to be passed with the same language by the House and Senate. So if there's been a ton of amendments added into a bill in one of the chambers, the other chamber has to agree to all of these changes that have been made. Now, most of the time, it's not very easy to get both chambers on the same page. And this is where we see a conference committee coming into play. A conference committee is made up, and it is members of both the House and the Senate in order to resolve those disagreements on a particular bill. Okay, so the role of a conference committee is to find that common ground so that way the big issue at hand can still be passed by the president. Okay, so this is a big negotiating part between the House and the Senate. Lastly, we have our subcommittee. Okay, a subcommittee can be a small group of people from an overall committee. So say you have an overall committee that has membership of 20 people. Okay, so you've got a standing committee on forestry, and there's 20 members that serve on this committee. Well, say there's something really specific that we need more research on, or we need to get an expert opinion on. That committee may form what's called a subcommittee, where they may say, hey, you 5 people, we want you to go off and do more extensive research and then bring back your findings to the whole committee. Okay, so it's a members of a committee, just a small group of them going off and doing a specific task or job in order to bring back that information to a full committee. Finally, we're going to kind of finalize talking about what is the process of making law by taking a look at interest groups, because they do play a heavy role in the laws that are passed through the Congress. So first off, what do interest groups do, and kind of who are these people? We're going to break down interest groups a lot in second semester, but essentially what you need to know right now is that they are special interest groups who receive funding or donations from members of the public or even maybe from companies. Okay, the NAACP is an interest group. Okay, there's a lot of different types of interest group, but essentially these interest groups are experts in giving legal advice. So they receive funding from the public. Maybe the public has a common view or a common goal, and so they will pay this group to further help legislation. Okay, this is called lobbying. That is the first role that we see interest groups really play, where representatives will use what interest groups have written as law. So we will see sometimes interest groups write up a bill, and then they will hand it over to a Congress member, and that Congress member will then introduce it into a committee on their behalf. So an interest group is able to do a lot of research, gather data in order to make a really good bill, but only a member of Congress can introduce a bill into a committee. Okay, but it's essentially a group that is able to help provide that data, time, expertise, where a Congress member's too busy to do that on their own. Next, we see interest groups playing a role in law by looking at their role in litigation. And essentially, litigation is when you are suing people on behalf of your group because someone else has broken a law. Okay. Next, we see interest groups playing a role in the lawmaking process by their use of amicus curiae briefs. Okay. This is Latin for friend of the court. And essentially what happens here is if you have a civil rights court case, for instance, the NAACP may submit data, interviews, past research into that court case in order to help influence or educate the jury or judge who is making the decision. Okay, so we got lobbying, litigation, amicus curiae briefs. So we have a lot of different types of interest groups here in the United States. We're going to break down some of the basic ones for you, but just know there are many types of interest groups out there, and we fall into a lot of different categories. So taking a look at the economic side of an interest group, okay, you have labor unions and businesses. Okay, so take for instance, as a teacher, I am in a labor union, which means I pay a due every month to the MEA, which is the Michigan Educators Association. They are also part of the NEA, which is the National Educators Association. So every month I pay this due into this group, and then the group is able to use that funding in order to do heavy research on education, in order to look at teachers and their interests when it comes to laws. So I'm helping pay towards better laws when it comes to education because of my involvement in labor unions. Now, I'm not only helping them, but labor unions also help teachers by, again, having good legislation come through that benefits us. I also can be represented in court if I need to be by someone of my union. Okay, so I get union representation when it comes to the courts. On the other side, you also have businesses who are going to have interest groups. And that may be advocating for policy about trade, right? Trade among the state, trade for interstate commerce, right? Like how does Michigan trade with Indiana? Okay, all of that involves the business side of things, and you need laws in order to cover those topics. We also have environmental interest groups. Okay, this is groups that either are on the side of trying to protect the environment, or again, maybe on that business side of things of trying to get rid of the barriers to creating a product or a service for the population. Okay, so again, trying to advocate for either side. Next, we have equality interest groups. These are your civil rights interest groups. The big one that everyone knows is the NAACP, and they're advocating for laws and legislation that represent minorities or groups that have historically been oppressed throughout our history. Next, we have consumer and public interest type of interest groups. And these interest groups are made, or their goal is for the collective good, or to make sure we have safer goods. So making sure that our vehicles are safe, right? There are laws out there that vehicles have to meet a certain standard in order to be sold or driven on the roads. Okay, interest groups have a play in creating those laws. Next, any safer goods. Okay, so girls, think about any makeup you've ever put on. Okay, boys, any hairspray, I don't know, fingernail polish, deodorant, perfumes, anything that is going on or in your body has most likely been vetted through an interest group. Okay, and there are consumer laws dealing with ratings of safety, what kind of chemicals can be used, all of those things. Interest groups played a role in making sure that legislation was good and was going to protect the consumer. So this is where we're ending today, at least for my specific portion of the lecture. So go ahead, take a look at some different videos on how does a bill become a law, what are the roles of the committee system, and then what role do interest groups have. I know we covered a lot today, but you guys are awesome and I know you can do well with whatever you're given. So please reach out, let me know if you have any questions along the way. Best of luck.